Princess Snow White, known back home as the fairest in the land, and known to audiences worldwide as the original Disney princess, as well as the titular character in the first animated feature film ever produced. Walt Disney considered Snow White to be the complete and perfect story, one of kindness, jealousy, true love, and overcoming adversity, a timeless story that has endured for generations. With the upcoming live-action feature film right around the corner, why don't we take a look back at the original animated Disney classic which made Snow White a global icon, as well as the earlier cartoons which inspired the film. And for those looking for other animated adaptations of the Snow White tale, we will revisit each and every animated adaptation and appearance of Snow White in cartoons and animation throughout the 20th century. The Snow White fairy tale was first published in 1812 in Germany by the brothers Grimm as part of the first edition of their collection, Grimm's Fairy Tales. In the original story, Snow White is a beautiful young princess whose jealous stepmother, the evil queen, orders her death. Snow White escapes and finds refuge living with 7 dwarfs, before being tricked by the evil queen into eating a poisoned apple which puts her into a coma, until a prince awakens her. The two fall in love, marry, and live happily ever after as the evil queen eventually meets her downfall. Snow White is described as having skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, while the original story also established other elements we've come to associate with the fairy tale, such as the magic mirror, the poisoned apple, the glass coffin, and the characters of the evil queen and the 7 dwarfs, who were first given individual names in the 1912 Broadway play Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, and then given different names in Walt Disney's 1937 film. Snow White was first portrayed in animated form by Fleischer Studios in the Betty Boop cartoon Snow White, first broadcast on March 31st, 1933, and which featured Betty Boop playing the title character in a very loose adaptation of the original fairy tale. The short was something of a one-man show. Dave Fleischer was credited as director, but virtually all the animation was done solely by Roland Crandall, who was given the opportunity to make Snow White on his own as a reward for his several years of devotion to the Fleischer studio. Snow White took 6 months to complete, and is considered both Crandall's masterwork and an important milestone in the golden age of American animation. Walt Disney was reportedly inspired to make his film due to the success of the Betty Boop version of the fairy tale, although in other interviews Disney also cites his having seen the 1916 silent film version as a teenager as the primary reason for choosing Snow White for his first feature production, as he considered the fairy tale to be the perfect story. Disney had originally planned to produce Snow White as a silly symphony short, but believed it had enough potential for a feature film adaptation, and plans for the world's first feature-length animated film were first announced in July 1934, with a basic story outline completed by the end of October that year. Initial sketches for Snow White's character were rejected by Walt Disney as being either too provocative or too cartoonish. An American artist and animator, Hamilton Lusk, was tasked with the challenge of making Snow White believably human and more realistic than any of the Disney Studios' previous animated characters. Lusk's initial sketches depicted Snow White as an awkward, skinny and gangly teenage girl with the rubbery limbs and exaggerated facial features of other early animated women, like Popeye's Olive Oyl or Persephone from the 1934 silly symphony short The Goddess of Spring. While Disney's animating staff had enough experience in the animation of animals, their experience in designing humans was severely underdeveloped, and The Goddess of Spring was among the first of a string of short films in which they used human characters, providing much needed practice for the upcoming major motion picture. The designs on both Snow White and the Evil Queen were refined further by Norm Ferguson as well as Grim Natwick, best known for drawing Betty Boop and someone whom Walt Disney considered an expert on animating women. Interestingly, initial sketches depicted Snow White with blonde hair and later red hair, until finally the animators returned to the roots of the fairy tale and gave the princess hair as black as ebony. I do want to move on to other Snow Whites and not spend this entire video talking about the movie, a film which deserves its own video. I'm sure all of you have seen it by now, and what can I say about this film that hasn't been said already? At the time of its release, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was an overnight and international sensation, and has remained in a league of its own as both an adaptation of the Snow White fairy tale and as an animated film, being the first full-length animated feature film ever released, and its influence has extended far beyond the world of animation. Even after almost 90 years, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs continues to be named by critics as one of the greatest animated films ever made, and still regularly tops lists of most popular Disney animated films among fans. As for Snow White herself, her design is both timeless and recognizable, a blend of traditional and contemporary fashion, strongly influenced by both classical art and illustrations, as well as Hollywood actresses of the time. Early illustrations of Snow White by Heinrich Lutermann and Franz Hüttner often depicted her with fair skin, dark hair, and a modest dress. Elements are carried over into the Disney version, while Disney artists also studied illustrations from Golden Age illustrators like Arthur Rackham and Gustave Doré, whose fairy tale depictions often featured soft, flowing silhouettes and expressive characters. Although Snow White is depicted in rags at the beginning of the film, she later dons her signature look, a traditionally feminine dress incorporating the three primary colors, and her iconic outfit consists of a blue bodice, puffy red and blue striped sleeves, an ankle-length yellow skirt with a self-sewn white petticoat and a high white collar, along with yellow shoes, a brown cape with a red interior, and of course, the signature red bow in her hair. Her high white collar and puffed sleeves with slashes are reminiscent of Renaissance and Baroque fashion, particularly from Germany, aligning with the Grimm brothers' German heritage, while her red bow headband is a nod to period headdresses, making her look both regal and youthful. Her short wavy bob was inspired by the flapper hairstyles of the 1920s and 1930s, giving her a modern look for audiences of the time, while her rosy cheeks, expressive eyes and red lips also reflect the Hollywood glamour of early silent films. Actresses like Janet Gaynor, Claudette Colbert, and Shirley Temple influenced her delicate and charming appearance. Furthermore, her gentle, idealized face resembles Raphaelite and Rococo paintings, while her warm, inviting expressions and poses were designed to evoke the charm and grace seen in Victorian-era sentimental art. As the first Disney princess ever, Snow White is the pioneer of the Disney Princess franchise, and in 1987 became the first female fictional character to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Disney's depiction would also go on to dominate the image of Snow White during the next century. As we will see, virtually all future animated adaptations were influenced, either directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, by this iconic portrayal. The next animated adaptation of the Snow White story came in 1973 in the final episode of the Rankin Bass anthology series Festival of Family Classics. The episode was a fairly faithful adaptation of the original fairy tale, although Snow White's outfit is virtually a carbon copy of the Disney princess, with only the red bow in her hair being replaced by a flower. The Snow White story would see a surge in popularity in Japan, as we saw 4 anime adaptations of the fairy tale being produced over a 10-year period. The first coming in 1977 as part of the anime anthology series Manga Fairy Tales of the World. The interesting thing about this series was that each tale was produced by a different staff who gave each episode their own distinctive style, and the Snow White episode was directed by Masami Hata, best known for directing the feature-length film Little Nemo: Adventures in Slumberland. In 1986, another anime adaptation of the Snow White story appeared in the 3rd episode of My Favorite Fairy Tales, a Japanese OVA series produced by Studio Unicorn alongside Shuki Dibi and Haim Saban. Another Japanese anime anthology series, Grimm's Fairy Tale Classics, produced by Nippon Animation, released a 4-part Snow White episode from December 1988 to January 1989. 1994 saw the release of the animated short film Snow White and the Magic Mirror, a comedic take on the classic fairy tale which featured the 7 dwarfs as parodies of famous comedians of the time. April 1995 saw the release of the direct-to-video animated musical Snow White, produced by Jetlag Productions, known for their animated adaptations of various classic fairy tales, myths, legends, and novels. Snow White was the company's sixth and final fairy tale adaptation. And 1 month later, in May 1995, we were treated to a special rendition of the Snow White story in the form of HBO's Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales for Every Child. Each episode of the series was a multicultural take on classic Western fairy tales, taking place in different settings and inspired by different cultures around the world. And the 12th episode of the first season set the Snow White story in the American Southwest with a Native American twist about a beautiful young woman named White Snow, who befriends the 7 mystical little men. And the episode featured an entirely Native American voice cast. Snow White, produced by Golden Films and released in 1998, was a pretty standard but faithful musical adaptation of the story as part of their Enchanted Tales series, based on classic literature and fairy tales. And Snow White featured a talented voice cast, including Kat Susi voicing Snow White and Jim Cummings voicing the Huntsman. Aside from these animated adaptations of the Grimm brothers' classic fairy tale, Snow White would make additional appearances in various animated retellings of the story or cameo appearances in other animated series, beginning in the 1960 episode of Yogi Bear, entitled Snow White Bear, where Yogi's hibernation is interrupted by the Snow White story playing out outside his cave. Here we have a notable exception where the Hanna-Barbera animators seem to have gone out of their way to portray Snow White as differently as possible to that of the Disney princess, even going so far as to depict her with blonde hair. Hanna-Barbera would use Snow White again, albeit with a more conventional look, in one of the most bizarre crossovers imaginable, which saw the princess saved by none other than the Harlem Globetrotters in the 1980 television special The Harlem Globetrotters Meet Snow White. The special featured fictionalized Harlem Globetrotters from their Hanna-Barbera series of the same name, while the late Russi Taylor voiced Snow White, and would also voice Disney's Snow White in the House of Mouse TV series. In 1980, Filmation also released a sequel to the Snow White story, A Snow White Christmas, which revolved around the return of the Wicked Queen, who is unexpectedly brought back to life during Christmas and casts an evil spell that freezes the entire land, and it is up to the young Snow White, daughter of the original Snow White, to save the day alongside her new companions, several friendly giants. Snow White appeared in the 1986 episode of It's Punky Brewster, when Glömer uses his magical abilities to bring all the characters from the book to life, and Snow White is once again pursued by the evil queen, this time in a contemporary setting. A memorable parody of Snow White appeared in the 1988 episode of Mighty Mouse, The New Adventures, entitled Snow White and the Motor City Dwarfs, which saw Mighty Mouse pitching his own retelling of the 1937 Disney classic. Happily Ever After was Filmation's second sequel to the Snow White story, as well as the studio's final production, completed in 1988 but only released in 1993. This time, just as Snow White and the prince are about to be married, the late evil queen's brother arrives and vows to avenge his sister's death, before Snow White flees into the woods once again looking for the 7 dwarfs, but instead meets the dwarfs' female cousins, the 7 dwarfs, who inform Snow White that the 7 dwarfs have opened up another mine somewhere else and the dwarfs have moved into the dwarfs' cottage. Happily Ever After premiered in the Philippines in 1989 and in Italy and France the following year, but because Filmation Studios was shut down in 1989, the film only saw a release in the US in 1993, the same summer that Disney's Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs received a re-release. Happily Ever After was subject to endless legal issues from Disney and additionally performed poorly at the box office and among critics, although a video game based on the film was released for the Super Nintendo in 1994. The Legend of Snow White was a Japanese anime series based entirely on the original fairy tale, and which considerably expanded the Snow White story over 52 episodes, beginning with Snow White at an early age, while developing backstories of secondary characters from the original material, as well as introducing new ones. The Legend of Snow White ran from 1994 to 1995. And Snow White appeared in the 1997 Animaniacs segment Cute First, Ask Questions Later, where Snow White is told by the magic mirror that she is no longer the fairest in the land, and the princess decides to settle the score with her new rival, Dot. A stage adaptation of Snow White would appear in the 1965 episode of The Famous Adventures of Mr. Magoo, where Mr. Magoo played the role of all 7 dwarfs. And Snow White would be parodied by various cartoon characters over the years, including Penelope Pitstop, Brittany and Alvin and the Chipmunks, Orson from Garfield and Friends, Princess Peach from the Mario Brothers franchise, Rhonda in Elf Tales, even Hello Kitty in an episode of Hello Kitty's Fairy Tale Theatre. Of course, Snow White would go on to make many notable appearances in animation in the 21st century, but that's a video for another time. For those of you looking for other animated adaptations and would prefer a darker take closer to the original fairy tale, I would recommend the episode from the anime anthology series Manga Fairy Tales of the World, or the later anime adaptation from Grimm's Fairy Tale Classics. For something more lighthearted, closer to the world of Saturday morning cartoons, be sure to check out the episode from the Rankin Bass anthology Festival of Family Classics, or the even lighter and comedic Snow White and the Magic Mirror. And for those who have time and would like to delve deeper into an expanded Snow White story, I highly recommend The Legend of Snow White, which was as well developed as it was beautifully illustrated. I try to make this list as comprehensive as possible, so please do let me know down in the comments if there were any other animated adaptations or appearances of Snow White in the 20th century that I may have missed. Also, let us know which of these animated adaptations you would recommend, or if you feel the 1937 Disney version was the quintessential Snow White story. Please like this video if you learned something today, and consider sharing this with anyone you know who may learn something too. I'll be back again soon, so until then, thank you for watching all the way to the end. Stay safe and stay tuned for more cartoon history.